Hello there and welcome. Tonight, allow me to gently guide you into one of the quieter, dustier corners of human history, the kind not often lit by torchlight or remembered in glory. It's a realm where well-intentioned minds sometimes stumbled, and strange contraptions were born not out of malice, but of misplaced ambition, fear, or confusion. This is a story not of triumph, but of curious failure, of the worst inventions from medieval times. So find a soft place to rest. Let your thoughts slow like the winding tick of an ancient clock. Perhaps the rain taps faintly on your window, or the warmth of your blanket folds around you like parchment. Close your eyes if you'd like. Breathe gently. And now, let's begin. Long, long ago, in the time of abbeys and armoured knights, when the moon still watched over candlelit roads and the forests whispered secrets to themselves, humanity tried to solve its many problems in curious ways. But not all solutions were wise. Our journey begins not with a siege engine or a battle helm, but with something far more delicate, a small iron mask shaped like a bird's beak. In the 14th century, during a time of plague and panic, physicians in parts of Europe turned to a device now infamous, the plague doctor's mask. Its beaked silhouette is iconic, but what is less known is how utterly useless it often was. The long beak, stuffed with dried flowers, herbs, or even vinegar-soaked sponges, was not merely theatrical. It was meant to ward off bad air or miasma, which many believed caused the Black Death. And yet, beneath its eerie calm was a terrible irony. The very invention intended to protect often offered a false shield, a sense of safety that did not exist. The herbs may have smelled sweet, but the breath of death still passed through. The waxed fabric gown did little to keep the fleas and infected air at bay. And while the doctor walked through the streets, a ghost in black, what he carried was not salvation, but misbelief. And there was something else about the mask, something that history does not always mention. It dehumanized. To the sick, the sight of the bird-faced figure brought not hope, but dread. To children, it was a nightmare made real. And to those dying in their homes, it meant the world had truly turned, that something unnatural now stalked through the daylight. This mask, this strange invention, was not just a failure of science, it was a haunting emblem of fear, crafted in desperation, worn with solemnity and remembered with a shiver, and yet it is only the first. As the centuries inched forward and the great wheel of invention turned, stranger creations followed. Have you ever heard of the chastity belt? Not the romanticized steel undergarment whispered about in popular legend, but the crude, real designs occasionally imposed upon noble women. Often fashioned from iron and leather, these contraptions were said to preserve virtue, though they more commonly preserved discomfort, infection, and misery. Some scholars now argue many examples are more theatrical or symbolic than real, but a few were indeed worn, and when they were, they did little to protect dignity. Imagine it, the clinking of metal beneath layers of linen, the rust that crept in after rain. The skin pinched, the hygiene compromised. It was not a tool of safety, it was a prison. And then, as the tale winds deeper, we find a curious creation tucked into the pages of old court records. An invention so ill-conceived that it seems almost absurd. The ducking stool. It was used not on criminals, but often on women, particularly those accused of gossiping or being witches. A long wooden chair, suspended over water into which the accused would be strapped and dumped. If she drowned, she was innocent. If she floated, she was guilty. Justice turned upside down. To imagine this contraption is to hear the creak of damp wood, the splash of icy river, and the gasps of an onlooking crowd. It was not meant to find truth, it was meant to instill fear, to silence voices, to suppress. And it was born not from ingenuity, but from superstition dressed up in engineering. And still, the list continues. Imagine now, in your mind's eye, the clatter of hooves on cobblestone, the dim torchlight flickering on an enormous rolling cage. This was the iron brank, sometimes called the scold's bridle, a metal mask fastened around the head with a protruding plate inserted into the mouth, designed to prevent speech. Worn publicly, it humiliated and subdued. What problem was this meant to solve? Gossip, argument, outspoken thought, not disease, not hunger, not war, just voices deemed inconvenient. And in that silence, history weeps a little. But perhaps one of the strangest inventions, one lost to the footnotes of time, is a little-known device known as the trebuchet toilet. Used by certain castle builders who tried to design indoor plumbing systems that emptied via gravity into the moat below, these toilets occasionally backed up during sieges. You can imagine the results. Medieval engineering, despite its marvels in bridges and cathedrals, was sometimes clumsy in practice. And nowhere was this clearer than in those moments when what was intended as a private comfort became a public embarrassment. Sometimes the worst inventions were not terrifying. Sometimes they were merely unfortunate or absurd, or in hindsight, heartbreakingly wrong. Yet what binds them all, from the plague mask to the chastity belt to the brank, is that they were made by people trying, in their own way, to fix things, to control what they feared, to preserve what they valued, to shape a world they didn't yet understand. And so, as our tale begins, we will follow these inventions one by one, across battlefields, bedrooms, courtrooms and kitchens, through villages and fortresses, monasteries and marketplaces. Each chapter will reveal a new artifact of failure, each more peculiar than the last. For history is not only written by the victors, but haunted by their mistakes. Now rest, let your breath slow, and when you're ready, I'll take you to the next page of this quiet, strange tale. The fire crackles gently in the hearth, shadows rise and fall upon ancient stone. Outside, the wind may stir the leaves or whisper across the moorland, but here, within this soft stillness, we return, and our story continues, deeper now, into chambers where silence is both companion and warning. Let us open the second page. Imagine, if you will, a castle's courtyard in the early morning light. Dew glistens on damp flagstones. The air is heavy with the scent of cold iron and old smoke. Nearby a device looms, tall, grim, and unmistakably cruel. This was the breaking wheel, also known in darker whispers as the Catherine wheel. It was not designed for war or defence or even deterrence, but for punishment, spectacle, control. One of the most infamous devices of medieval justice, it reflected an age in which pain was not just inflicted but displayed. Let us understand it gently, without haste. The breaking wheel was large, a cartwheel often made of thick oak, sometimes reinforced with metal. The condemned was tied to it, arms and legs outstretched, and the executioner would strike each limb with an iron cudgel, systematically shattering bones. In some instances, the body would be interlaced through the spokes, left for birds and weather to finish the work. Why such a horror? The official reason was often treason, or murder, or defiance of the crown. But beneath the surface, it was more than justice. It was a lesson, told in screams and silence, shown to every peasant, farmer and child who wandered too close to the execution ground. But what made the breaking wheel one of the worst inventions was not only its cruelty, but its calculated slowness. Medieval minds understood speed. They knew of swords that could end a life in a blink. But this device was designed to stretch suffering, to display death, not deliver it swiftly. In some cases, the broken body was kept alive, perhaps granted a final blow to the chest as a form of mercy. In other instances, the victim was left for hours, even days. And yet, the wheel was not just a tool of punishment, it became a symbol, feared, invoked, whispered about in cold corners of conversation. Its mere mention could silence arguments. It travelled across borders and generations, from Germany to France, from the Balkans to Scandinavia. The wheel spun, not in motion, but in memory. And here we must pause, not from horror, but from sorrow. Because what drives a society to invent such a thing? Fear, certainly. Anger. But more deeply, the desire for control, to tame chaos through terror. And in this way, the wheel joins a lineage of creations born not from brilliance, but brutality. Let us leave the wheel behind, now that its shadows have lengthened across the cobbles. We turn a little further into the archives, to a more obscure, but no less troubling, invention. The combat cage, rarely spoken of, scarcely illustrated, but documented nonetheless. This device was a curious blend of law and violence. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire and feudal France, trial by combat was sometimes rendered not in open field, but within a confined iron cage, a narrow prison of bars and straw. Two men, often accused of the same crime, were placed inside with rudimentary weapons. They would fight. One would die. The other, declared innocent, or at least victorious. It was a spectacle with the thinnest veil of justice. The combat cage wasn't designed for honor. It was not a knight's duel in the courtyard, nor a battlefield engagement. It was cramped, brutal, and often ended quickly. No room for parrying or finesse. No audience of nobles, only guards and maybe a priest. It was blood and mud and shouting. And here again, we find the flaw. The Inventions' failure wasn't only in its cruelty, but in its premise, that truth could be found through violence. That fate or divine will would grant victory to the righteous. But fate is fickle and steel is indifferent. A stronger man might win, though guilty. A desperate man might survive, though innocent. And in the quiet aftermath, when the cage door creaked open and one body lay still, what remained was not justice, but silence. The cage, like the wheel, tells us much about the medieval world, how power was enforced, how fear shaped invention. And yet, it also whispers something else, that pain was often misunderstood as order. From here we drift to another strange corner, one hidden not in stone castles, but in rural superstition. The witch pricker, a simple tool, a needle, sometimes retractable, sometimes not, carried by self-proclaimed witch hunters in the 16th century, though its roots stretch back further. The device was used to test for witches' marks, small blemishes, moles or scars believed to be signs of a pact with the devil. The method was chilling in its simplicity. The accused, usually a woman, would be stripped and examined. Any mark that failed to bleed when pricked was taken as proof of guilt. Some witch prickers carried retractable blades, needles that slipped back into the handle, producing no wound and confirming the false judgment. Imagine the dread. The cold metal, the prying eyes, the irreversible consequence of a mark too old or a needle too dull. Here invention became deceit. It was not made to discover, but to accuse. It confirmed what fear already, and while the witch pricker itself may have been small, no larger than a quill, its legacy was enormous because it contributed to an era of hysteria where fire consumed truth and reason was drowned in superstition. So many of these inventions, if we listen closely, share something in common. They were not designed to elevate humanity, but to suppress it. They came not from the desire to understand, but to control, to isolate, to eliminate. And still, they were used. Because behind every failed invention is a moment in which someone thought it made sense. And so, dear listener, we begin to see the fragile line between innovation and folly, a line often crossed in the shadow of fear. Tonight, as we let these memories settle like dust upon ancient shelves, we may ask ourselves, what truly separates progress from punishment? But that question we shall explore another time. The morning mist clings softly to the crumbling ruins of stone towers, and somewhere far off a bell tolls. Not in alarm, but in rhythm, marking time like a heartbeat beneath the silence of the past. Our path now leads us away from the heavy footfalls of executioners and inquisitors, and instead drifts toward the quiet absurdity of the everyday. Because not every terrible invention of the medieval world was built for violence. Some were born of practicality. Misguided though they were, some were created not out of cruelty but confusion. And it is here, in this gentler but no less curious domain, that we find the next chapter of our story. Let us now open the door to the kitchens and workshops of yesteryear and peer into the heart of domestic life, where invention met ignorance in the most unfortunate of ways. We begin with something deceptively simple, the medieval attempts at indoor heating. Long before central heating systems and carefully vented chimneys, homes relied on open hearths. The fire was life. It warmed, it cooked, it comforted. But in castles and manors, particularly those in colder climates, a problem emerged. How to keep rooms warm without choking inhabitants with smoke. And so was born the smoke canopy, an architectural feature designed to capture and redirect smoke upward. Except it rarely worked. These early canopies were shallow, poorly angled, and made from flammable materials. Instead of channeling smoke out, they often trapped it inside. The result was a home that perpetually smelled of ash and char, its walls coated in soot, its inhabitants coughing through long winters. And worse, when sparks leapt and wood caught where it shouldn't, entire buildings were lost to flame. But that was not the end of heating woes. Enter the stone bed warmer. A flat slab of heated stone placed beneath or inside the bed to provide warmth through the night. In theory, a clever solution. In practice, one that left burns, cracked mattresses, and sometimes smouldering sheets. Later versions used metal pans filled with hot coals. slid between linen sheets, a fiery gamble disguised as comfort. The pursuit of warmth, noble as it was, often edged too close to danger. Yet warmth was only one concern. Cleanliness, or the medieval version of it, brought its own cascade of calamity. Let us speak now of the urine-soaked laundry technique, a common practice in parts of Europe where human urine was collected and used as a natural ammonia cleanser. It was effective, in a way. Urine rich in urea did indeed act as a detergent when left to ferment into ammonia. But the process? Buckets of waste were left to sour in corners. Cloth was scrubbed in troughs that reeked of rot. The scent clung to skin and fibre alike, and worse still, it attracted vermin and sickness. What had begun as a clever, if distasteful, approach to cleaning became a hazard in itself, an invention of routine that quietly harmed those who relied upon it. And in the very same realm of hygiene, we stumble across a haunting curiosity, the communal sweat house. Saunas, in essence. But unlike their carefully controlled modern descendants, these were crude huts filled with smoke and steam, often shared by many, sometimes dozens. In some communities, men and women would bathe together, believing that the heat would purge illness. The flaw was not in the steam. Heat has long held healing properties, but in the lack of sanitation. The same basins were reused, the same sweat soaked the benches, wounds were opened and never covered, and with no understanding of bacteria or transmission, infections spread quietly in the warmth, disguised as relaxation. Still, the sweat house remained a staple in many towns, passed from one generation to the next, a well-meaning invention that carried unintended consequence. And now, as the candle flickers low, let us consider something stranger still. The powdered lead face mask, popular among the nobility. Beauty standards in the late Middle Ages began to shift, and pale skin, untouched by sun, unmarred by freckles, became a symbol of status. To achieve this look, women applied cosmetics made from white lead and vinegar, creating a smooth porcelain-like mask upon the face. It shimmered in candlelight. It whispered of grace and elegance, and it poisoned slowly. Lead absorbed through the skin, accumulated in the blood, and caused tremors, hair loss, even madness. The very product meant to enhance allure eventually destroyed it, but the damage came gently, without warning. Day by day, a little more sickness, a little more silence. These powdered masks, worn in courts and ballrooms, were masks in more ways than one, concealing not only the skin, but the hidden decay beneath. What is most tragic is not simply that these inventions failed, it is that they were embraced, celebrated, normalised. No one thought the warm stone might burn. No one questioned the pungent bucket beside the wash basin. No one paused as the white powder crept slowly into the body's marrow. And that is perhaps the most haunting truth of all. That the worst inventions do not always arrive with clanking chains and cruel intention. Sometimes they sit quietly in the corner of the room. They fold neatly into routine. They are accepted. Because people, in their eagerness to solve problems, often overlook the subtleties of consequence. And here, in the stillness of this moment, we reflect. The medieval world was not ignorant, it was resourceful. It built with what it had, stone, fire, belief, instinct, but sometimes it built blindly. Sometimes it warmed its feet over coals that would later consume the house. We move forward now, deeper into these quiet halls of history, where more such curiosities await. Strange answers to stranger questions left behind like footprints in fading snow. The air grows still as we step deeper into the labyrinth of forgotten ideas, where time-worn manuscripts whisper half-truths and inventions slumber beneath layers of dust and disbelief. The torches of castles flicker behind us, and we drift now into a different space. One not of domestic trial nor brute punishment, but of science, or rather what passed for science in the wavering candlelight of the medieval mind. Because even in the most shadowed centuries, humans longed to understand, to measure the world, to explain the sky, the stars, the body, the soul. And in this earnest pursuit, they sometimes created things not just ineffective, but deeply, exquisitely wrong. Let us now open the great iron-bound book of medieval medicine. Here, within its musty pages, lie diagrams drawn with trembling hands, charts of humours and spirits, of stars that ruled the blood and seasons that governed the bones. In these beliefs were born inventions meant to heal, or so they thought. We begin with the Zodiac Man, an illustration common across medieval Europe. The Zodiac Man was a figure, sometimes sketched in the margins of Bibles or medical almanacs, covered in astrological symbols. Each sign governed a body part. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on, circling down the frame like a celestial blueprint. Physicians consulted the zodiac before bloodletting, before surgery, before treatment. If the moon was in Leo, one must never treat the heart. If in Pisces, stay away from the feet. What made this invention so dangerous was not the image itself, but the belief behind it. Lives were risked based not on symptoms but on starlight. A man dying of infection might wait days for the proper alignment. A woman in labour might be denied aid, lest the moon ruin her luck. No tools were used, no machines, but belief, when structured and shared, becomes its own invention. And in this case, it guided the hand as surely as any blade. From there, we descend further into the world of medieval health, into the practice of trepanation. One of the oldest known surgical procedures in human history, trepanation is the act of drilling or scraping a hole into the skull to relieve pressure or release evil spirits. In medieval Europe, it was performed using crude augers or sharp rocks, and astonishingly, some patients survived, but many did not. The reasoning behind it was simple. If someone was ill in mind, melancholic, mad, possessed, or plagued by headaches, it was assumed something unnatural had taken root inside the skull, and so it must be let out. The tools were not sterile, the wound rarely cleaned. Flies circled as bone dust fell. The very act that was meant to heal often brought swift, silent infection. And yet it was practiced, it was taught, it was respected. There is something profoundly human in this, in our desperate willingness to cut into mystery with our bare hands, to fix what we do not understand with whatever is closest. It speaks not of evil, but of longing, of helplessness masked as certainty. And now we come to the leech, a creature so entwined with medieval medicine that it almost became a symbol of it. Bloodletting, though ancient, found its peak in the Middle Ages. Physicians believed that the body's balance of four humours, blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, determined health. Too much blood and one grew feverish, rash-covered or overly passionate. The solution was simple: remove it. And so leeches were kept in glass jars, carried in satchels, applied to temples, to thighs, to the soft underside of the arms. They fed slowly, gorging in silence. Sometimes dozens were used in a single session. And not always by trained healers. Barbers, midwives, monks, all might reach for the leech. It was used for everything from nosebleeds to depression, from childbirth to the common cold. What's more, the procedure was often repeated over days. And while in some rare cases bloodletting may have had minor benefits, most of the time it weakened the patient, and in times of plague or famine, it often led to death. The leech, in its quiet way, joined the ranks of the worst inventions. Not because it was a tool of violence, but because it became a standard, a tradition, a truth that no one questioned. And in the candlelit corners of monasteries and infirmaries, another invention took root: the urine wheel. A circular chart, sometimes painted on wood or carved into stone, that matched the colour of a patient's urine to potential ailments. Amber meant good digestion. Cloudy green foretold infection. Pale blue, bewitchment. Monks would collect samples in glass vials called urinals, hold them to the light and compare. No microscope, no testing, just observation, guesswork, and a deep belief in colour as diagnosis. And while observation is indeed the heart of medicine, here it wandered into illusion. The urine wheel was not malicious, nor was it entirely without merit. Certain infections do change the colour of waste, but the conclusions drawn were often wild. A man with liver failure might be treated for curses, a woman with kidney stones might be blamed for adultery. And worse still, treatments would follow: potions of ground antler, infusions of burnt toad, or rituals of confession. Here invention met mythology. And lastly, let us pause before a final object in this chapter: the quarantine bell. Used in many towns during outbreaks, the bell was hung from the neck of those infected with plague or leprosy. It was a signal, a warning. The wearer had to ring it as they walked, announcing their presence. What began as a safety measure became a symbol of shame. Children would cry at the sound, shops would shut their doors, and the ill, already in agony, would walk alone, marked not only by disease but by fear. This bell, perhaps more than any other invention in this tale, speaks of the medieval heart, noble in hope, misguided in action, and forever haunted by what it could not control. So many of these creations began with good intentions. They were not designed to maim or mock. They were born of limited knowledge, of desperate times, of a world where death knocked often and science had no armour. But in their failure, in their echoing legacy, they remind us just how far we have come and how fragile progress truly is. And in the next breath of history, more such ghosts wait, quietly ticking behind clock faces and hidden inside forgotten scrolls. The night deepens as we pass through another shadowed corridor of memory, and our feet now tread upon floors lined not with stone or straw, but with ancient plans inked in soot and imagination. Gone are the healers and householders. In their place, we enter the chambers of those who built, who designed, who dreamed of defending themselves against invisible enemies and monstrous fears. For the fifth part of our tale takes us to the world of defence, of gates and moats, of traps and towers. Yet even here, in the heart of strategy and craftsmanship, folly found its way in. Not every wall held strong, not every invention guarded well, and some were so profoundly impractical that they bordered on the absurd. Let us begin with a peculiar structure known to historians as the murder hole misdesign. Murder holes were a common feature in medieval fortresses. They were small, slanted openings cut into ceilings or walls of gatehouses and passageways, allowing defenders to drop stones, boiling oil, or other noxious surprises onto attackers below. When designed correctly, they were devastating. But as castles multiplied and inexperienced builders imitated their grander cousins, a strange pattern emerged. Murder holes placed above open courtyards instead of choke points, or worse, directly above the castle's own walkways. Some of these were built purely for show to impress visiting nobles. Others were simply misunderstood by the masons copying blueprints they barely comprehended. But their result was the same, an architectural invention that looked fearsome but functioned poorly or even dangerously to its own occupants. Imagine defending your home only to find your boiling pitch pouring onto your own guards. A grim comedy, a folly in stone. But worse still were the castles that added reverse-facing battlements, crenellations designed to face inward, not outward. Why? Some believed they were meant to dissuade betrayal from within. Others argue it was simple error, misreading diagrams passed from builder to builder. Whatever the cause, the idea of shielding yourself from your own courtyard while remaining exposed to the hills beyond marked a spectacular failure of purpose. These mistakes remind us. In an age before standardized engineering, each blueprint was as good as the person interpreting it, and sometimes invention was little more than architectural gossip. From the castle walls, we now turn to the moat, that deep trench, often filled with water, encircling many a fortress with the promise of protection. But here lies another misstep, the stagnant moat. Many medieval engineers believed simply digging a deep ditch and filling it with water would deter invaders. But without flow, without channels or sluices, the water quickly turned. Algae bloomed, insects bred, the stench grew foul. What was meant to defend became a pit of pestilence, attracting disease, mosquitoes and rats. In some cases, moats became so foul that castle inhabitants fell ill more often than the soldiers camped beyond the walls. What had begun as a defence against siege quietly evolved into a slow siege from within. The stagnant moat was not a trap for enemies, but for its own creators. Yet perhaps no invention better captures the duality of genius and absurdity than the war pig. Yes, pigs. In some regions, records tell of pigs being doused in flammable oils and set alight, then driven toward enemy lines, especially war elephants or cavalry. The squealing, burning animals were thought to terrify both beasts and men, breaking formations, disrupting charges, and for a moment it worked. But the chaos could not be controlled. The pigs, maddened by pain, often turned and ran back toward friendly lines, setting fire to tents, wagons and wooden barricades. A battlefield invention that required absolute precision, used in conditions defined by chaos. The war pig, however, cruel and tragic, stands as a testament to the desperation and imagination of medieval warfare. Nothing was off the table, even animals were weaponized. Even suffering was harnessed in the name of victory. And then there were the towers. Let us now drift our thoughts to the portable siege tower, a massive wheeled structure meant to be rolled up to enemy walls, allowing attackers to climb up and over. In the right terrain, with the right army, they were effective. But in regions with marshland, hills or thick forests, they were a disaster. Wheels stuck in mud, bridges cracked under their weight. Sometimes, the mere act of moving one consumed more time than the siege itself. One record speaks of a French army spending 3 weeks building a siege tower only to find it too tall to fit under the nearby trees. In another case, a tower collapsed while being rolled forward, having been constructed too hastily, crushing a dozen soldiers beneath it. These were not failures of bravery, they were failures of scale, of not asking can we, but rather should we. And lastly, let us speak of the anti-siege mirror, a rarely mentioned, almost mythical idea whispered among some early thinkers and alchemists, that mirrors, properly arranged, could focus sunlight into a beam capable of setting enemy machines aflame. Inspired perhaps by tales from the ancient world, a few medieval thinkers tried to replicate such a device. They crafted curved metal plates, polished glass, even enchanted stones, convinced that light itself could become a weapon. But the truth was sobering. Medieval materials lacked the precision required. The sun could not be summoned at will. Wind and weather refused to cooperate. And the soldiers waiting with torches often grew tired long before the mirror's focus caught flame. Still, drawings survive. The idea lingered, and some even died pursuing it, blinded by reflections or burned by their own experiments. In this way, the anti-siege mirror became less an invention and more a symbol of human hope, unmoored from practicality. So many of these designs, the upside-down battlements, the flaming pigs, the towering siege wheels, remind us that even in defense, ambition can outpace understanding. That in trying to shield the world from chaos, we sometimes invited chaos in. And as the wind curls around broken parapets and forgotten battlements, these failures echo quietly through time, not as mockery, but as memory, because even the worst inventions leave their mark. If not in glory, then in the soft, sobering lessons of what not to build again. The wind has stilled now, caught somewhere between the echoes of clanging iron and the hush of forgotten prayers. As our story wanders deeper into history's quiet crevices, we find ourselves at the threshold of belief, not in gods or saints alone, but in forces unseen, forces imagined, feared, and revered. This 6th chapter leads us into the solemn halls of superstition, a realm where invention did not always come from wood or stone, but from ritual, from charm, from the desperate need to explain the unexplainable. And so mankind created tools not only to defend the body, but to safeguard the soul. Here, in this strange twilight between logic and law, we uncover some of the most haunting and at times tragically useless inventions of all. Let us begin with the witch bottle. Crafted most commonly in the 15th and 16th centuries, the witch bottle was a small vessel, often ceramic or glass, filled with curious contents. Pins, nails, hair, fingernail clippings, herbs, even drops of urine. It was buried beneath thresholds or placed in hearths to trap curses or reflect hexes cast by witches. The logic was meticulous if bizarre. The sharp objects would pierce the spell, the urine would confuse the spirit, the bottle would become a prison for evil. In some towns, every home had one. Even physicians, those trained in the humours and the zodiac, kept them beneath their floors. But what was meant as protection sometimes bred fear. Neighbours accused each other of causing broken bottles. Children were punished for playing near buried charms. And in desperate cases, bottles were forcefully shattered to release trapped spirits, spreading panic and paranoia through entire villages. The witch bottle became not a shield, but a symbol of suspicion. And it was not the only such creation. Let your mind drift now to the holy fever chains. During times of pestilence, it was common to see iron chains fastened around the necks or waists of the sick, not to restrain, but to cure. These chains, blessed by priests or relic keepers, were believed to ward off spirits of disease. Often etched with verses or adorned with small crucifixes, they were worn until the illness passed or the patient did. The belief was that iron, as a metal forged in flame, held power over the ethereal. But of course, the true nature of illness was bacterial, not demonic. And the wearing of heavy, rusting chains weakened the frail further. cutting into the skin, promoting infection, causing fevers to worsen under the sun's heat. What began as faith became a weight too literal to bear. And then there was the corpse bell. In an era where the line between life and death was often blurred, when coma, catalepsy or seizure might be mistaken for final breath, people feared being buried alive. So the corpse bell was created, a small bell attached to a string which ran from the buried coffin up to the surface, often tied to the wrist or finger of the departed. If the bell rang, the gravekeeper was to rush to the site and dig. The very invention revealed the depth of fear and mistrust in medicine. Though rare, there were recorded cases of bells being heard, but more often the strings snapped or the earth shifted. Wind rang the bell where no breath remained. And in some chilling accounts, gravekeepers chose not to respond, either out of disbelief or the morbid reasoning that if the dead had returned, they should be left to rest once more. The corpse bell hangs in our minds like a trembling thought, that even in death, invention tried to offer one last chance. From graveyards we move now to homes, and here we find the angel trap, a misnamed device if ever there was one. The angel trap was a charm-laced contraption hung above the doors of children's rooms. Believed to keep wandering spirits, good or ill, from entering, it often consisted of feathers, twisted twine, small bones and blessed wood. The idea was to distract the spirit, confuse it, trap it in the weave of the object until sunrise. But when illness still struck, when fevers still took hold, when breath ceased in the cradle, the trap turned from shield to scapegoat. Parents blamed its misplacement, midwives blamed its construction. Some families even placed blame on the child, declaring them beyond saving, touched already by a force that no charm could bind. And so, the angel trap became a cruel reminder of helplessness, a fragile sculpture of hope destined to break. We turn now almost gently to a place quieter still, the monastery. In sacred libraries and cloistered rooms, monks crafted sin registers. These were not mere logs of confession, but elaborate devices, some mechanical, some symbolic, used to track the sins of an individual across seasons or years. One peculiar design from a Benedictine order in Central Europe used a wooden dial, similar to a clock, with levers for each cardinal sin. As monks confessed their transgressions, they would rotate the dials accordingly, resetting them at Lent. It was meant to instill discipline, a mirror of the soul. But it fostered obsession. Monks feared moving the dials. Others refused to reset them, believing they would forget their past sins. One abbot reportedly destroyed his device in despair, convinced it remembered too well. The sin register became not a path to redemption, but a weight of shame, an invention that turned introspection into ritualized guilt. And so, across the countryside, across the cloisters, across the graves and thresholds and sickbeds, medieval people continued to invent, not always with iron or fire, but with fear. They forged here the dead, bottles to hold evil, chains to bind fevers, dials to track the soul's missteps. None of it worked, and yet none of it was foolish. These were not jesters' toys or idle playthings. They were born from love, from grief, from the aching desire to protect, to heal, to understand. In this way, they may be the most human inventions of all. But still, they failed. And in their failure, they remind us of a time when belief tried to substitute for knowledge, when imagination tried to fill the spaces left by science, and when every shadow held a question with no clear answer. As the candle dims, as the night thickens, we step softly beyond these ghostly charms. There are more strange contraptions waiting in the wings, not of soul or sickness, but of order, of punishment, and of power misunderstood. The hours deepen, and with them the silence thickens. Not just the silence of the room around you, but of pages never read aloud, of punishments long erased from law, yet echoing still in the dark corners of old towns and stone keeps. We've passed through homes and sickbeds, past the broken logic of desperate healers and well-meaning builders. Now the path carries us through the narrow alleyways of law, medieval justice, brutal and theatrical, clothed in the illusion of order. And in this seventh part, we uncover not only flawed inventions, but the terrifying belief that cruelty, when structured, could be righteous. Let us begin with the shaming masks. These were not the executioner's masks, nor the ceremonial hoods of secret societies, but devices forged in iron and leather, worn not by the punishers, but by the punished. often shaped into grotesque faces with exaggerated features. Pig snouts, twisted smiles, donkey ears. These masks were locked onto the heads of those deemed liars, gossips, or heretics. Each design matched the offence. A tongue of metal for the scold, a devil's face for the blasphemer, horns for the unfaithful. The intent was not merely to humiliate, it was to transform, to turn the person into the sin, so that all who saw them would not remember the woman or man, only the mask. Those forced to wear these creations were paraded through marketplaces or made to sit in church pews for hours, heads bowed beneath the weight of cold iron. Some masks had spikes on the inside, others were connected to chains pulled like leashes, and while some wore them for mere hours, others days. These masks were not tools of correction, they were theatre, and they worked not by teaching but by silencing, by isolating, by making monsters of ordinary people. Not far from these grim visages we find the cucking stool, a cousin to the ducking stool, but crueler in its persistence. This was a wooden chair, often suspended over a pond or river, where women, and occasionally men, were bound and repeatedly dunked for offences like adultery, immorality, or simply being a nuisance. The process wasn't meant to drown, but to humiliate, and sometimes to cool the temper. But rivers are not precise, ropes snap, currents shift, and many were dragged under too long, or struck their heads, or caught pneumonia after long exposure. The cucking stool pretended at discipline, but it offered no path to redemption. It was punishment without repair, a slow public erasure of dignity. And what of the heretic's fork? Rarely discussed, seldom remembered, this instrument was simple. A metal rod with two prongs on either end, placed vertically between the chest and chin, or chin and collarbone, and fastened by straps. The purpose? To prevent the wearer from lowering their head, sleeping, or speaking without pain. A single nod could drive the prongs into flesh. It was used during inquisitions. Silent torture disguised as restraint. No blood, no screams, just hours, days of stillness. Muscles burning, eyes unable to shut. A punishment for thoughts more than actions. For holding beliefs that strayed from the sanctioned path. And still, it was just one piece in a gallery of devices, crafted not for law, but for obedience. In certain towns, those accused of theft, even petty theft, were forced to wear the iron collar of rings, a device that encircled the neck with a fan-like array of metal hoops, each a foot wide. It was impossible to lie down, to pass through doors, or move through crowds unnoticed. The thief was made into a moving spectacle. Sometimes bells were attached, so that with every movement they sang their shame, and though no blade was drawn, the wound this collar left was permanent, in the mind, in the heart, in the social web that no longer welcomed them. Then there was the pillory, often confused with the simpler stocks. The pillory held its victim upright, head and hands locked into place, exposed to sun, wind, and ridicule. It was common, familiar, but its invention was tragically efficient. It turned justice into a festival. Crowds gathered. Rotten food was thrown, stones if tempers flared. Children were encouraged to jeer, to spit. What began as a sentence became a performance where the community enacted its anger upon the body of one person, whether they were guilty or merely inconvenient. Some fainted, some were injured, some even killed. Yet the pillory remained a staple for centuries because it cost nothing. It required no bloodshed, and it made punishment a shared event, a ritual of belonging for the crowd, and of exile for the accused. But perhaps the strangest of these judicial creations was the shame flute, used primarily for punishing bad musicians. Yes, truly. The shame flute was a heavy iron tube, shaped like a recorder or simple flute, fitted with clamps that locked the fingers and hands in playing position. It hung from the neck. The condemned could not use their hands. They could not play or eat or rest easily. In some cases, bells were added to the ends. In others, notes were engraved, mocking inscriptions about discordant tones or the death of harmony. Imagine it, a musician who played poorly or angered a noble, now forced to wear their failure like a necklace of noise. Absurd? Yes, but no less real, no less cruel, because even absurdity, when institutionalized, becomes a weapon. All of these inventions, masks, forks, flutes, stools, collars, share something in common. They are instruments not of justice, but of spectacle. They did not mend the harm, they did not teach, They made examples, they transformed individuals into symbols, and in doing so, they erased the complexity of the human behind the act. In the medieval world, shame was not private, it was engineered, sculpted, worn like a second skin, and these devices, twisted as they were, allowed that shame to travel, to echo, through the marketplace, through the village square, through the centuries. And as we walk past these iron remains, as the air cools and the echo of bells fades into the quiet of night, we are left with one thought, that justice, when shaped by fear and hunger for control, can become its own kind of invention. And among all inventions, it may be the most dangerous of all. The hour is late now, and the air carries the weight of everything we have unearthed. The scent of old iron, the echo of sorrowful laughter, the sting of forgotten torments. But still we walk, softly, through these halls of memory. And tonight our footsteps take us not through dungeons or altars, but across fields and furrows into the heart of medieval survival, the farm. Because for all the castles and cathedrals etched into the mind's eye of the Middle Ages, it was the farm that fed the world, the farmer who bore the weight of kings. And yet, even here, especially here, the inventions meant to ease life often did the opposite. In this 8th part, we turn to the strange and sometimes disastrous contraptions born of toil, of rain-soaked soil, of hopes planted alongside seed. Let us begin with a humble yet hopeless device, the 3-pronged plough fork. At first glance it looked promising, a wooden tool with curved tines meant to lift and turn soil faster than a spade. Its design was intended to break clods more efficiently, to move manure with ease, and to aerate stubborn ground. But there was a flaw. The spacing of the tines, narrow and fixed, failed to account for the dense, clay-heavy soils common across much of northern Europe. Instead of gliding through, it snagged, it stuck, it snapped. Farmers often spent more time repairing the fork than using it. Its handles were thin, prone to splintering, and worst of all, it tore at roots, disrupting the very crops it was meant to nourish. But it looked clever. It seemed new, so it was copied, sold, praised, until its failures became undeniable. Next, we find the rotary sheep shear, an ambitious contraption developed by tinkers in rural France and Bohemia, attempting to speed the shearing of wool. 2 wheels connected by a rudimentary crank rotated twin blades over the animal's body. The theory: rotate, snip, a rhythmic, almost musical pattern of shearing. But sheep do not sit still, they wriggle, they panic. The rotary device, made of iron and oak, could not adjust to movement. It pinched the skin, it tore wool unevenly, and in the worst cases it gashed the animal, ruining fleece and injuring livestock that had taken months to raise. Shepherds soon abandoned it, returning to manual shears, but not before many flocks had suffered from a machine that favoured efficiency over empathy. And then there was the pigeon-powered seed scatterer. Yes, such a thing was truly tried. In a few scattered towns across England and Germany, records speak of a harness designed for doves or pigeons, strapping a small leather pouch of seed to the bird's chest with a hole to release grain as it flew. The idea was charming. Let birds fly in rows across fields, scattering seed in graceful arcs, fewer labourers, faster coverage. A marriage of nature and need. But birds of birds, they did not fly straight. They dropped the seed all at once, or not at all. Some refused to fly, weighed down by the pouch. Others flew too far, seeding the roofs of barns and the mud near rivers. Worse still, birds learned to peck at their own harnesses, eating half the seed mid-flight. It was a whimsical dream, undone by reality. And in the end, seed was spread by hand again, the old way. Among the stranger devices found in records is the wind-driven scare drum, a tall wooden pole topped with hollow gourds or small drums of hide, designed to rattle and beat when the wind blew, scaring crows and deer from fields. It was primitive, musical, eerie, and incredibly loud. But while the sound may have startled animals, it also tormented villagers. It played through the night. In storms, it howled like a chorus of ghosts. Children wept at the sound. Shepherd dogs barked incessantly. And in one particularly dry season, a drum loosened, fell and rolled, crushing early sprouts as it tumbled. The scare drum fell into disuse within a decade, but its unsettling melodies lingered in rural stories for years to come. We turn now to the realm of transport, and to the double yoke cart. Designed for small farms with only one ox, the double yoke cart was an attempt to mimic the strength of two animals by balancing the load across a single creature with a widened frame and split shafts. But the cart was poorly weighted. The strain fell unevenly. The ox tired faster, some collapsed, others bucked, injuring handlers. What's more, the wider design made it hard to maneuver through narrow paths or between tilled rows. It stuck in ditches, it jammed at gates, and when it tipped, which it did often, the repair was slow and laborious. Another invention made with noble purpose, but no understanding of the burden it truly imposed. And now, we pause before a device as cruel as it was ineffective. The tickle harness. In parts of Central Europe, farmers experimented with contraptions designed to keep children awake during long planting sessions or field watches. The tickle harness was a lightweight wooden frame worn on the back with dangling feathers or threads meant to tickle or irritate the wearer if they nodded off. Children as young as 7 wore them in fields or while guarding sheep at night. But fatigue cannot be outwitted so easily. The harnesses chafed, the feathers became soaked in rain, the irritation turned to rash. Some children grew frightened, associating sleep with punishment, and in time they collapsed anyway, exhausted, humiliated, aching. The tickle harness did not last, but the idea that discipline could be mechanized, imposed by discomfort, reveals much about the hardship of rural life and the desperation to wring productivity from every waking hour. Finally, we come to one of the saddest inventions, the wooden calf mask. To trick cows into giving milk for an orphaned calf or a substitute animal, farmers crafted wooden masks shaped like the head of a lost calf, worn by the new one. The intention was simple: deceive the mother into feeding. But the masks were stiff, heavy, poorly painted. Cows, sensitive and intelligent, recognized the fraud. They kicked, they panicked. Some calves were injured, others starved, all for an illusion, a wooden lie placed over a living face. It's easy to smile at these things from the safety of centuries, to chuckle at flying pigeons or tickling harnesses, but each one carries the fingerprints of someone's hope: a farmer praying for better yield, a shepherd trying to save time, a child too tired to stand. These were not fools, they were survivors. But in their striving, in their quiet desperation, they sometimes built not bridges, but burdens. And so the land remembers not just the seeds and the sweat, but the failures buried among them. Failures carved into wood, failures drawn in mud, failures that remind us, even on the most honest ground, invention can falter. Especially when the land is cruel, the season short, and the stomachs waiting at the table far too many. The night has grown still again, still in that way only old stories make possible, where the ticking of centuries softens into a hush and the past leans close enough to breathe against your shoulder. We've walked through cathedrals and courtrooms, across fields and under gallows, and yet the tale remains unfinished. Now our path turns toward the mind, or rather, the medieval attempts to understand it, shape it, and when necessary, break it. For the 9th chapter leads us through the quiet, sometimes whispered history of education, obedience, and the inventions meant to mold the human spirit into something it was never designed to be. Here we find not great machines, nor towering devices of war, but small tools, everyday objects, subtle disciplines born not of malice but of certainty, the kind that rarely asks if it is right. We begin with the memory nail board, used in monastic schools and later adopted by rural tutors. The memory nail board was a handheld plank lined with short, blunt pins. Students, often boys training for priesthood, were instructed to press their fingertips against the board when they failed to recite a verse or misquoted a psalm. Not to bleed, not to scream, just to remember. It was believed that pain, if measured and quiet, could etch lessons into the mind more deeply than repetition. Some boards bore tiny engravings, verses, Latin prayers, or even moral instructions, so that the student, while pressing their hands, might read and absorb. But hands are sensitive. Skin breaks. Infection finds even the smallest wound. And what began as a discipline soon turned into a punishment, with teachers pressing harder, longer, beyond the border between lesson and cruelty. It was a tool meant to teach, but it only taught fear. From there we moved to the discipline cap, also known as the dunce hat, though its original use was far more severe than the pointed cap of later centuries. In early grammar schools, students who struggled to learn were not corrected privately. Instead, they were made to wear caps. tall, heavy ones, sometimes embroidered with insults or the symbol of a donkey. These were not soft. They were made of stiff leather or stiffened cloth, weighted with stones, designed to cause discomfort during long hours of sitting or standing. The child became the lesson. It was not enough for them to feel shame. Others had to see it, learn from it, fear it, and when the cap alone did not suffice, some teachers tied bells to it, forcing the wearer to announce their every move with sound. Even movement became punishment, even silence impossible. From those grim halls of learning, we drift toward the more shadowed world of obedience and the iron prayer ring. Used in certain monastic orders as a tool of penance, the iron ring was worn around the waist or thigh, fitted with inward-pointing teeth that pressed against the flesh when one moved too quickly or sat down improperly. It was said to sharpen prayer, to remind the wearer of humility. Some rings were worn only during meditation, others for days, and while they were not designed to bleed, the flesh often bruised and over time scarred. It was not enough to bow the head. The body had to be bent, literally, physically, painfully, into devotion. And not just in monasteries. In certain noble households, a child guilty of disobedience might be forced into a confinement box, not as punishment alone, but as reflection. A small wooden container barely large enough to sit inside, with air holes and a slot for food. They called it the humility cell, an imitation of monastic solitude, but applied to children. Some spent hours inside, others entire nights. The box was supposed to soften pride to cool tempers, but it rarely did. Instead, it carved anxiety into the corners of the mind, an association between silence and shame, stillness and sorrow. Let us pause now at the false recitation rod. Invented as a test of truthfulness during oral exams, it was a thin wand held by the instructor and used to tap the student's knuckles lightly after each mistake. Unless, of course, the mistake was intentional. The rod was not for punishment, but discernment. It was believed that guilt could be provoked with touch, that a lying child would react differently to the rod than an honest one. This belief was widespread in some regions. Some rods were even carved with phrases like "Veritas lux mea," "Truth is my light." But how could a child, shaking from cold or fear, prove innocence with stillness? How many flinched simply out of pain from the last mistake or out of fear for the next? It was not a device for truth. It was a mirror of the instructor's certainty, and mirrors, when cracked, reflect only fragments. And what of the restraint quill? A slender tool that, when tied between the fingers or wrists, prevented hand movement, used to correct posture in writing or prayer. One had to sit still to align the soul with the body, but hands tremble, muscles cramp, blood falters. Some students learned to hold their quills rigidly, not out of grace, but because it was the only way to avoid punishment. And when the quill snapped, the lesson began again. Lastly, we arrive at the obedience harness. Rarely spoken of, mostly found in records from isolated abbeys or orphan asylums, the obedience harness was a padded strap system that bound the torso and legs into a seated position, often used overnight or for children who were said to fidget too much during religious instruction. Its goal was not pain, but compliance. Stillness became holiness, silence became virtue, and movement, that most natural impulse, became something to be corrected, bound, and watched. So many of these inventions shared the same face, quiet, subtle cruelty. They were not loud, they did not scream, but they whispered into the ears of children and novices that learning was pain, that obedience was worth more than curiosity. That discomfort built character. We sometimes believe the medieval world taught with sticks and fire. And yes, it did. But more often it taught with shadows, silent humiliations, with rituals and contraptions that left no scars on the body, but many on the soul. And as we look back on these tools, these small everyday things once treated as wisdom, we may begin to see them for what they were. Not paths to enlightenment, but chains mistaken for lanterns. In the soft spaces where learning should grow, they planted fear. And fear, once rooted, is very hard to dig out. The night has grown thick, not with sound, but with the hush that only comes after long remembrance. 10 chapters now, and still the past unfolds like a winding staircase, spiralling deeper into a forgotten cellar. We've seen the masks, the prisons, the paddocks, and the pulleys. But in this 10th descent, we arrive at the strangest chamber of all, the place where invention touched entertainment. For in the medieval world, life was often hard, hunger familiar, and sorrow close. But even then, the people sang, they laughed, they sought amusement. And yet, even in joy, there were inventions that failed so spectacularly, or cruelly, that history has all but buried them. Let us begin quietly with the cranked puppet wheel. Designed as a portable form of street theatre, this rotating wooden wheel held small carved figurines, jesters, knights, even saints, fixed to strings, which danced when a central crank was turned. The idea was that one person could operate an entire play, turning the wheel while narrating or singing. It was clever in theory, and captivating to watch for a moment. But the wheel jammed, the strings tangled, the crank teeth, often made of bone or soft wood, wore down after only a few performances, and when the puppets moved out of rhythm, jerking, stuttering, the magic faded. Children wept at the broken saints, crowds mocked the twisted marionettes. In some towns, the device was renamed the liar's wheel, because it promised wonder and gave only noise. Next we come to the laughing hood, a curiosity found in royal courts, particularly among jesters and fool guilds. The laughing hood was a padded cap fitted with bells, feathers, and sometimes a spring-loaded device that twitched when the wearer moved. Its purpose? To make even stillness funny, to turn the body into a joke. But the springs were crude. They snapped. The feathers drew flies, and the bells, always jingling, always echoing, became unbearable. Some jesters begged to remove them. Others suffered injuries when the inner pins dislodged during acrobatics. The laughing hood made laughter a costume, but it could not make it kind. From jesters we move to the tournaments, the grand displays of chivalry and might. And here we find the invention known as the tilting sled. It was meant to allow untrained knights, or ambitious squires, to simulate jousting. A wooden sled, weighted with stone, was placed on rails opposite the trainee. As it slid forward, the rider would brace with his lance and attempt to strike a shield or dummy on the moving target. But the sled moved too fast, or too slow. It wobbled. It jumped the rails. In one notorious incident recorded near Bruges, a tilting sled derailed, launching its stone weight into a crowd of onlookers, injuring a noble's son and ending the practice in that region altogether. The tilting sled sought safety, training without harm. But like many such dreams, it failed to grasp the force it tried to replicate. Now let us drift into more obscure amusements. The scent ball carousel, a short-lived luxury toy popular in some courts, particularly among noble women. The carousel was a spinning stand, often gold-gilded, which held small cages of herbs, flowers, and pressed oils. When turned, it would release aromatic breezes meant to calm or delight guests. But herbs rot, oils curdle. Mice chewed the cages, the spinning created nausea in enclosed spaces, and the mingled scents, when mixed poorly, gave rise to headaches and sneezing fits. Worse still, when candles were placed too close to warm the oils, the entire carousel became a fire hazard. Several burned, taking with them precious tapestries, gowns, and in one case, a section of an abbess's library, an invention born of elegance, undone by its own indulgence. And then there was the whimsy wheel, a strange contraption found in certain rural festivals, often during harvest. It was a large, vertically mounted wheel upon which participants placed small items, tokens, symbols, sometimes even wishes written on parchment. The wheel would spin, and where it stopped, a small compartment would open with a prize or a punishment. A kiss, a pie in the face, a dunk in the river. But like many things, the wheel was soon corrupted. Punishments grew harsher, a slap with a switch, eating spoiled bread, being locked in the stocks for an hour. One town banned it after a noble's daughter was selected and refused the penalty. The wheel was burned, others followed. The whimsy turned to cruelty and the laughter soured. Let us now pause at a chilling object, the singing mask. Used in certain pageants and masks, it was a decorative face covering fitted with reed pipes at the mouth. When the wearer breathed out or spoke, the pipes were supposed to create an eerie, melodic sound. The effect was surreal when it worked. But breath is not music, and reed pipes, when moist with sweat and spittle, warp. The sound became garbled, wheezing, or screeching. Some masks collapsed inward, suffocating the performer mid-line. One masked singer in the court of a minor Bavarian duke collapsed from lack of oxygen, the pipes having blocked entirely. The performance was cancelled. The masks vanished from fashion within a year, and still the list goes on. The laughing dice, which shocked the hands with tiny coils when thrown, intended as a joke but often painful. The floating stage built on pontoons for river plays, which sank during its first performance when actors danced too enthusiastically. The melody jug, a clay vessel designed to whistle when water was poured from it, producing a note, but which often cracked under pressure, slicing fingers and spilling precious drink. Entertainment, you see, is no guarantee of safety. And in the medieval world, where joy was rare and moments of mirth fleeting, the urge to create novelty often outpaced the wisdom to make it last. These inventions were not forged in malice, nor from desperation. They were playful. They sought wonder, surprise, delight. But joy is delicate, and when shaped by the wrong hands, it can bend into cruelty or crumble into embarrassment. Yet we cannot fault those who tried, because in the bleakness of their days, among famine and frost, between sermons and storms, they tried to laugh, to sing, to dance, even if the masks suffocated, even if the dice stung, even if the wheels spun toward shame. In that there is something strangely beautiful, that the worst inventions were born from the hope that something, even briefly, could be fun. The night is deep now, not simply in darkness, but in the weight of memory. We walk further, slowly, carefully, past the echoes of laughter that turn to silence, through the corridors of good intentions gone awry. And as we move into the 11th chapter of this long, hushed tale, we find ourselves standing at the edge of one of the most sacred places in the medieval world, the church. But even here, where belief was thick as incense and walls were carved with prayers, not all that was built in faith stood strong in wisdom. The Middle Ages saw the rise of glorious cathedrals and inspired liturgy, yes, but it also saw inventions in worship that were misguided, misused, or simply misunderstood. Let us open the heavy oak door and step softly inside. We begin with the automated reliquary. In an age when pilgrimage defined spiritual life, churches sought ways to elevate the experience and their prestige. One such invention was the self-moving reliquary, a shrine or container holding sacred bones or artifacts, often fitted with cranks, levers, or hidden wheels to produce small mechanical movements during sermons. A saint's arm might raise in blessing, a carved face might bow, the relic itself might spin slowly on a platform, shimmering in candlelight. It was meant to stir awe, to bring the divine closer to the eyes of the humble, but the mechanisms often failed. They creaked. They stuck. One reliquary in a French abbey reportedly launched a glass vial of holy oil into the choir by accident. Another's crank snapped, sending the hand of St. Jude tumbling into a nun's lap, causing such panic that the mass was halted for the day. The sacred became spectacle, and spectacle, when flawed, breaks more than illusion, it breaks trust. Next we turn to the flagellation bench, used not only in monastic orders but also in public processions during penitential festivals. It was a long, low wooden platform with slots for knees and elbows, designed to hold the penitent in a bowed position while they whipped themselves in atonement. Some benches included rough surfaces, such as embedded stones or cold iron spikes meant to enhance the sense of suffering. Some were even inscribed with phrases, mortificare carnem, mortify the flesh. But the invention quickly slipped from spiritual discipline into performative agony. It became a way for individuals to be seen, praised, admired for their devotion. In cities like Siena and Cologne, flagellation benches were paraded, decorated with flowers and followed by choirs, and as pain became spectacle, its meaning hollowed. Some fainted, some bled, others, trying to prove their piety, pushed themselves too far and never rose again. The bench was not for cleansing, it was a stage, and it taught suffering without wisdom. Then there is the atonement funnel. Rare and sparsely documented, it was used in certain punitive rituals for monks or clergy who had erred gravely, particularly those accused of gluttony or excess. The funnel, shaped like a long horn, was filled with bitter herbs, vinegar or brine, and slowly poured down the throat of the penitent during confession. Its purpose was symbolic, to cleanse from within, but it often led to vomiting, choking, or worse. One chronicled incident tells of a young deacon collapsing after being forced to drink a mixture of vinegar and ash. He survived, others did not. The atonement funnel did not purify the soul, it punished the body in ways it could not forget. And in some chapels, we find the curious invention of the sound lattice. Built into choir stalls or cathedral walls, these were narrow wooden grills. Acoustically designed, it was believed to amplify the voices of specific choirs or monks. Certain designs were built with secret chambers behind them, allowing a second choir to sing unseen, creating the illusion of angelic harmony. The goal was transcendence, to create the sound of heaven on earth. But wooden architecture plays its own tricks. The echo distorted, the voices merged poorly, a missed note became magnified. In one documented Easter Mass, a misaligned lattice created such feedback that the entire nave hummed like a hornet's nest, scaring congregants and forcing an evacuation. Heaven turned to noise, and worship to confusion. There was also the prayer crank, a small mechanical wheel attached to prayer rolls or rosary scripts. The idea was simple. Turn the crank and the scroll moved on its own, displaying the next line or stanza of prayer without needing to touch parchment with dirty fingers. It was, in essence, a medieval spiritual reading machine. But the cranks jammed, the scrolls tore, some versions made clicking noises that echoed during silent prayer, drawing disapproving looks, and others turned too fast, leaving the reader scrambling to follow sacred words that flickered like banners in the wind. The crank was well-meaning, practical even. But its failure reminded monks and nuns alike that some acts of devotion should not be rushed nor mechanized. Let us now move quietly to the sermon automaton, an experiment from a few ambitious cathedral builders, particularly in Germany and Flanders. This invention took the form of a mechanical figure, often a saint or angel, built to turn, gesture or nod during long sermons. A series of pulleys hidden in the pulpit could make the figure bow or raise a hand at certain scriptural moments. The aim was to keep the audience engaged, to animate the word. But audiences stared at the figure instead of listening. Some laughed. Children mimicked it. In one city, a parishioner was said to have shouted mid-sermon, "The saint agrees," referring to the figure's accidental nod during a controversial passage. Worship became pantomime, and devotion gave way to distraction. Finally, we arrive at the penance echo chamber. Constructed in some monastery confessionals, these small circular booths were built with curved walls designed to echo the penitent's voice back toward them. The goal, to force the speaker to hear their own sins out loud, not just once, but many times over. It was meant to deepen shame, to make remorse echo, literally, within the soul. But in practice, it often created confusion. The acoustics warped the words, some voices doubled over each other, the confessor couldn't hear clearly. And for the penitent, the repetition became torment, not cleansing. In at least one monastery, the design was blamed for a novice's breakdown. The walls, it was said, would not let his guilt stop speaking. These inventions, these misguided attempts to enhance worship, all share a painful thread. They tried to simulate holiness, to turn awe into mechanics, to structure what was always meant to be mysterious. And in doing so, they forgot something essential. That the divine, if it is to be felt at all, cannot be built like a clock, nor turned like a crank, nor echoed like a trick of sound. Still, we must not mock them, because these were not made in jest, nor with malice. They were made in longing to bring the sacred closer, to make the unseen a little more graspable. And that longing, though clumsy, was very real. But sometimes, in reaching for heaven, we slip. And in the fall, we build strange things, heavy things, things made of wood and brass and hope that collapse under the weight of their own reverence. The darkness now feels ancient, not oppressive, but vast, like the quiet that settles over ruins where no wind moves and no voice echoes back. The deeper we go, the softer the footsteps become, as though even time itself is reluctant to disturb what lies ahead. For in this 12th chapter, we step away from the shrines and fields and instead descend into the cold veins of medieval infrastructure, into the bones of cities, the strange tools of transport, and the quietly crumbling dreams of order. Yes, tonight we walk the roads. We begin with one of the most ambitious and ultimately fruitless inventions of urban management, the cobblestone urinal channel. As towns grew crowded and streets narrowed, the question of sanitation became pressing, though the science of waste was not yet understood. In certain Flemish and Italian cities, planners devised a solution: shallow grooves carved into cobbled alleys, leading waste, primarily urine, away from homes and toward underground channels or open pits. The idea was primitive plumbing, public and constant, but it failed. The grooves, exposed and shallow, often became clogged with mud, food and refuse. Rats followed the streams. During rain, the channels flooded and the urine mixed with everything else, creating an ankle-deep tide of stench. And in hot seasons, the smell became unbearable. They had tried to move filth quietly. Instead, they made it public, visible and inescapable. From waste, we now turn to water. The bucket lift well, an early attempt at automation, was designed to simplify the drawing of water from deep communal wells. A rotating wooden wheel, similar to a giant hamster cage, allowed a person to walk within and lift a series of connected buckets which would then tip into a basin. Elegant in theory, but the gears jammed. The buckets cracked, the ropes frayed under uneven strain. Children slipped while running inside the wheel, breaking limbs. In at least one city, the entire mechanism collapsed into the well, killing a man and poisoning the water supply for days with splintered timber and debris. The machine meant to ease thirst, instead spread fear. Next, let us walk slowly beside the brake shoe sandals. In mountainous regions where carts and sleds travelled down steep stone roads, a few inventors proposed footwear modifications for those pulling or guiding the cargo. These were sandals with wooden pads attached beneath the heels, meant to dig into the earth and slow descent. But they worked only on soft dirt. On cobbles, they slipped. On gravel, they locked. And in every case, they exhausted the wearer, adding pressure to the knees, the spine, the breath. Some even attempted to add iron nails to the pads for grip, turning each step into a dance with injury. The brake shoe sandal didn't save carts from slipping. It merely made the human body part of the mechanism vulnerable, exposed, and breakable. And what of the torch loop helm? In an age without streetlights, those responsible for guiding night travel, city watchmen, late messengers, even monks on emergency errands, sometimes affixed torches to their belts or hands. But in a particularly inventive burst, some blacksmiths created helms fitted with a forward-mounted iron loop, where a small torch could be secured, hands-free, light-directed, until, of course, the wind shifted, or wax dripped into the face, or a gust blew sparks into a dried wool cloak. The flame sat directly above the eyes, blinding the wearer with smoke or sudden flare. The helm became a burning crown, and more than one was thrown off mid-journey in panic. From misapplied fire, we step now into a quieter invention, the civic shadow dial. This was a type of public sundial meant not to tell time for prayer, but for order, to indicate when market stalls could open, when streets must be cleared, when the town gate would close. It was fixed to the central square, visible to all, but it only worked when the sun shone directly. Cloudy days brought confusion. Seasonal shadows shifted the marks, and its inscriptions, carved in outdated Latin or local dialects, were often misunderstood by travellers or illiterate farmers. In more than one town, disputes erupted over timing. One vendor opened too early, another stayed too late, and in a few documented cases, the dial was blamed for theft, the accused claiming the shadow had not yet passed. What was built as order became ambiguity, a measure of sunlight that tried and failed to govern lives. Let us now roll toward the multi-cart harness. This was an attempt by inventive merchants to increase the capacity of a single ox or mule by chaining together multiple two-wheeled carts, like a caravan on a smaller scale. It looked promising on paper. 3 carts, 1 beast, 1 driver, but in practice it failed almost instantly. Corners became impossible. The rear carts jackknifed, cobblestones shook the loads loose. One cart might tip, dragging the others into ruin. Worse, the strain on the animal was severe. The harness pulled unevenly, creating sores, broken yokes, and fatigue that led to collapse. The beast bore not only the weight, but the punishment of ambition. In cities and towns where these appeared, they were quickly banned. And now let us drift into the strange, the stone-filled slipper. Not an item of transport itself, but of etiquette. In some noble courts, it was believed that the gait of a nobleman, slow, deliberate, and slightly bowed, demonstrated humility and refinement. To enforce this pace, certain slippers were fitted with small stones or weighted soles. You could not walk quickly in them. To do was painful. They were worn during visits to cathedrals, funerals, or court meetings. But on uneven surfaces, they caused falls. On steps, they made balance treacherous. One bishop broke his hip descending a spiral staircase. Another knight was mocked after tumbling into a fish vendor's stall. Draped in trout and shame, the slipper was meant to humble, and it did, but not with grace. And lastly, we look to the direction stick. Before maps were common and compasses expensive, some travellers used long sticks with rotating arrows carved into them, one for north, one for the path home, one for the local monastery. These arrows were adjusted based on memory, sun, or instruction from others. But the stick did not remember. The arrows drifted. The names wore off. In the forest, it became meaningless. In cities, it spun like a weather vane with no wind. And worst of all, some trusted it above their own sense, wandering in circles, convinced the stick was right. One chronicler described it as a guide made of wood and hope. And that, perhaps, is the quiet refrain of all these failures. They were made of hope, hope that roads could be tamed, that movement could be orderly, that cities could breathe in rhythm. But the world is uneven. Roads twist, carts tip, rain falls. And no amount of cleverness can stop the ground from shifting beneath our feet. Still they tried. With wheels, with ropes, with cranks and levers and measurements carved in stone. And for every idea that failed, there is a kind of beauty, because they believed, if only for a moment, that they could make the world move more gracefully. Even if, more often than not, it didn't. The night now hums like an old hymn, long forgotten but still lingering in the cracks of ancient stone. We are close to the end, though time feels folded in on itself, like parchment crinkled by fire and use. And as we reach this 13th descent into forgotten design, we find ourselves no longer among builders or bishops or jesters, but in the realm of beliefs made law, and laws made cruel by their blind devotion to order without wisdom. Tonight, we explore the strange legal mechanisms, literal and figurative, that tried to standardize justice in the medieval world. Not with swords or cells, but with inventions that sought to quantify guilt, force fairness, or impose purity where none could be measured. And we begin with the cold logic of the ordeal cauldron. The ordeal as a practice stretched back centuries, but in the high medieval period, it took on new mechanical form, especially in the water trials of Europe. One version, used in both church and court settings, was a large iron cauldron suspended on a frame and filled with boiling water. A pebble or ring would be dropped inside, and the accused, often a peasant or low-born defendant, was ordered to plunge their hand in and retrieve it. The burn was not the punishment. No, the healing of the wound was the judgment. The wound would be bandaged by a priest, sealed and left for 3 days. If it festered, the accused was guilty. If it healed clean, they were innocent. The idea being that divine favour would manifest in the skin. But healing is slow, infection is quick, and the body does not follow the scripts of courts. More often than not, the verdict was made before the cloth was removed. Guilt whispered behind closed doors, confirmed not by the wound, but by the will of those in power. The cauldron endured for generations, not because it worked, but because it was visible. From fire to metal, we step into a quieter cruelty. The truth horn, rare, and found mostly in small townships of the Holy Roman Empire, the truth horn was a funnel-shaped instrument, part speaking trumpet, part symbol of authority. The accused would be required to speak into the narrow end of the horn during confession or interrogation. The device did not amplify. In fact, it distorted. But that was the point. Any hesitation, any stumble, any slurring of the voice became suspect. The sound warped, echoing back with unsettling tones. The crowd would murmur, the judges would note wavering in the voice. Guilt, they claimed, could be heard. It was not a tool for truth. It was a stage prop, a theatre of intimidation, cloaked in ritual. And then there was the weighing beam of virtue. This invention belonged to certain rural courts and religious tribunals. The accused was placed on one side of a large balance scale, on the other, holy texts, relics, or community oaths. The belief, if one was truly innocent, they would not outweigh righteousness. But human bodies are not equal. Clothing, illness, age all change the outcome. In practice, the righteous side was often weighed beforehand to produce the desired effect. In one village record, a priest added rocks inside a hollow Bible to ensure the accused woman tipped against the word of God. The scale did not measure sin, it measured control. From weights we move to numbers. and the curious contraption known as the confession abacus. Used in monasteries for cataloguing penance, this device was a wooden board with sliding counters, each bead representing a category of sin: pride, envy, gluttony, and so on. Monks would move beads during confession, tallying the offences, then consult a chart to assign prayers, fasts, or rituals. It was systematic, efficient, memorably precise, and entirely mechanical. One monk could confess to a lifetime of sorrow and receive 5 beads. Another, for a moment of laughter in chapel, might receive 7. The device gave the illusion of fairness, but it replaced listening with counting. One penitent wrote, "I was measured like grain in a sack, but I do not feel lighter." Let us now enter the realm of silence with the oathstone muzzle. In towns where oaths held the weight of law and false testimony could doom a life, an accused liar, especially one already suspected of perjury, might be forced to wear an iron muzzle with a stone bit held in the mouth. The stone was not small. It prevented speech grinding against the teeth and tongue. The accused would then be walked through the town, carrying the weight of their dishonesty. Some bit the stone in defiance, others gagged. A few choked and died. The muzzle did not correct lies. It ensured they could never be spoken again, whether false or not. And now, let us walk briefly into the dim record of the justice bell box. This invention, more ceremonial than practical, was used in certain villages for choosing jurors or deciding cases without a clear verdict. A wooden box filled with small bells, one of which was tuned differently, was passed among the group. Each person drew a bell and rang it. Whoever held the discordant bell was said to bear divine insight or guilt. The randomness was veiled as providence. A sound became a sentence, but bells lie. The clappers were tampered with, the tuned bell shifted over time. One councilman confessed years later that he had marked the rim with soot beforehand to guide the draw, yet the bell box continued, not because it served justice, but because it made judgment feel inevitable. Finally, we come to one of the strangest and saddest inventions of medieval legality, the mirror of clemency. Used in some feudal courts, especially when nobles passed judgment on vassals or serfs, the mirror was placed beside the accused. The idea: the lord or lady must look upon the condemned's face reflected next to their own before passing sentence. It was said to humanize, to remind the ruler of shared mortality, but few looked. The mirror gathered dust. The angle was poor. The face reflected back was distorted, fearful, tired. One record describes a baroness who ordered the mirror turned toward the wall, saying, "I know what I must do and need no reflection." The mirror became not a tool of mercy, but a silent witness to its absence. And so, in this chapter of Law and Order, of Balance and Bells, we see the heart of many medieval inventions, a deep desire for certainty, for truth to be seen, for guilt to be weighed, heard, measured, drawn, spoken, muted. But the soul is not a scroll, the conscience is not a counter, and when we try to simplify justice into tools, we may find ourselves holding devices that punish more than they protect, machines that reflect not fairness but fear. Still, they were made, because in a world of shadows and shifting truths, even flawed instruments felt better than none at all. The air has grown heavy now, not with fear but with reverence, a quiet that does not press or warn but simply waits, like an old friend sitting beside you in silence, hands folded, gaze distant. There is a kind of stillness near the end of a long tale, the kind that draws no line between sorrow and peace. And in this 14th chapter, we look toward the smallest inventions of all, those so often overlooked, so humble in design, that their harm was not seen in grand mistakes, but in the slow erosion of living. This is the domain of daily life, of tools, garments, gestures, and the invisible weights they placed upon the shoulders of people who simply tried to exist within a world carved by tradition, necessity, and fear. We begin almost gently with the knot-bed corset. Worn not for vanity but for posture, the knot-bed corset was a tightly bound garment fitted with interlaced ropes or corded straw, meant to hold the back upright for long hours of spinning, prayer, or writing. It was common among nuns, scribes, and even some noblewomen taught to sit gracefully. But grace came at a cost. The knots pressed against the ribs and hips, leaving bruises. In summer, they absorbed sweat and bred rashes. In winter, they stiffened and cut into the skin. One physician wrote that he had seen women with skin hard as leather and mottled like stone. It was not worn for beauty, nor protection. It was worn to become still, and stillness, when forced, always wounds. Now let us step into the kitchens and hovels and look at the double basin dish, a ceramic plate divided into two hollows, one for food, one for waste. It was designed to be efficient, to keep table and hearth clean, and was particularly used in orphanages and poorhouses. But in practice, it made hunger visible. Children were instructed to finish every bite, then scrape remnants into the second basin. If the two hollows looked too similar in fullness, punishment followed. Some hid food beneath their sleeves to avoid the scolding. Others cried when they saw their waist side heavier, a silent accusation in clay. The dish was meant to tidy. Instead, it taught shame in hunger, in waste, in appetite itself. And now we pause before the woolsack head brace, a tool of caretaking, used primarily with the elderly or infirm. It was a padded ring filled with coarse wool and herbs, placed behind the neck to prop the head upright during prayer or meals. But it was never washed. It grew damp, it matted. The wool turned to mould, the herbs to rot. What had once been comforting soon carried the scent of mildew and illness. Worse, the brace forced the neck into a rigid angle, straining the spine. Those who wore it often stared upward, not out of reverence but necessity. And in doing so, they saw ceilings instead of faces. Next, we come to a symbol more than a tool. The shame clasp. A simple bronze brooch or pin, plain and unadorned, worn by those who had fallen from grace in their guilds or churches. Unmarried mothers, failed apprentices, former lepers now healed but not forgotten. It bore no inscription. Its meaning was known by shape alone. People passed them in the streets and turned away. Some vendors refused to serve those who wore it. In some regions, the clasp was mandatory, a badge of re-entry into society. But reintegration should never look like branding. The clasp did not restore, it reminded. And reminders, when fastened to the chest, become chains. Let us move now to an oddity, the night spark cloth. Used in certain thatched roof homes, it was a heavy linen sheet treated with vinegar and hung above the hearth to catch embers during sleep. The idea was to prevent accidental fires in homes too poor for proper chimneys. But the cloth grew stiff. It trapped smoke, the vinegar stung the eyes, and when it caught an ember, it often smouldered silently, filling the room with a sour haze before bursting into flame hours later. It was a solution crafted from desperation, a fire break made of fabric and fear. We must speak now of the widow's rung, a rung removed from a ladder. After a husband's death, it was tradition in some villages to remove the second rung of the household ladder, symbolic of the wife's incomplete life. It was not to be replaced until she remarried, but the ladder remained in use. Climbing became harder, dangerous. Some fell. One woman, in a letter preserved in poor Latin, wrote, "I do not fear solitude, but I fear reaching my roof." The missing rung became not a symbol, but a daily reminder of incompleteness, built into the very structure of her home. And then there is the herb wall skirt, an apron-like garment fitted with pouches to hold medicinal herbs, carried by midwives, wise women, and some housekeepers, meant to keep remedies close at hand. But when medicine turned to accusation, when wise women became witches, these skirts became evident. St. John's wort, foxglove, rosemary, all common, all damning. More than once, a herb wall skirt was hung in courtrooms as proof of sorcery. What had once healed became a noose made of fabric and leaves. Now let us touch upon the twilight mirror, a polished metal plate kept in poor homes with no glass, used to reflect what little light remained after sunset. Its purpose, to give mothers a final glance at their sleeping children or help with evening prayers. But the reflection was warped, flickering. It bent faces and deepened shadows. Some believed it showed spirits. Others thought it watched them. A child's nightmare in one village described the metal moon that showed other mouths, and yet the mirror stayed because it was all they had. Finally, we pause before the most delicate of inventions, the grief spoon, a plain wooden spoon carved with notches, one notch for each lost child, husband, parent. It was kept not in the kitchen but above the hearth, displayed, honoured. But over time it became a warning, a tally of sorrow. Visitors counted the notches. Neighbours whispered. Suitors stayed away from women with spoons too scarred. One woman, it said, burned her spoon the day after her third child died. not out of despair, but because she was tired of counting what the world had taken. The spoon was never meant to be cruel, but even love, when quantified, becomes unbearable. These inventions, the corset, the spoon, the clasp, the cloth, did not march through history with fanfare. They sat quietly, on hooks, on shelves, in drawers. They were woven into the fabric of survival, and through that, they were accepted. But they shaped lives, not by failing loudly, but by enduring silently. And in doing so, they remind us of a subtle truth, that the worst inventions are not always those that wound the body, but those that press gently day after day until the soul learns to flinch without knowing why. The night now lies folded around us like a woolen cloak, quiet, heavy and warm with the hush of endings. 15 steps we've taken into the forgotten and the flawed, through corridors built not of stone but of invention gone sideways. And now in this final part, we look not at one device or place, but at the idea behind them all. Because beneath the metal and wood, the gears and parchment, the bruises and broken hopes, there is something deeper, a yearning, and tonight we arrive at the heart of it. This 15th chapter is not about a specific object, but the tapestry of intentions, the weaving together of imagination and ignorance that defined so many of the worst inventions of the medieval world. We gather now the scattered threads, to understand, to hold gently, to lay to rest. Let us begin with the illusion of improvement. Throughout the centuries we've walked, we've seen people attempt to fix what they did not fully grasp: fire without fireproofing, hygiene without microbes, law without mercy. And yet, at the moment of each invention, it must have felt like progress: the cooling dunking stool, the odourless seed, the clockwork sermon, the pain that purifies. But progress without understanding is performance, and performance demands an audience. That audience often was the village, the church, the Lord's court, those watching to see if the inventor could tame the world. And when the invention failed, it wasn't just the machine that collapsed, it was the illusion of control. Still, they tried again, because to invent is to resist chaos. And the medieval world was full of chaos: famine that came without warning, plague that killed without mercy, war that arrived on horseback, burned the fields and vanished before names were remembered. In that world, a lever or clasp or iron mask seemed like an anchor, however crude, in a storm too wide to comprehend. There was also belief, deep bone-set belief in things unseen: gods, devils, humours, moons, the weight of sin in the spine, the judgment of saints through stones, voices heard through mirrors, cures hidden in feathers and bells. Belief was a blueprint when knowledge had not yet arrived. And so many of the worst inventions weren't born of malice, but of certainty. Certainty that the stars could diagnose illness, that pain could prove truth, that machines could manifest holiness, that order, if carved deeply enough, could overwrite fear. But belief is powerful, and when belief meets invention, the result is not always revelation. Sometimes it is a muzzle, or a bench, or a flame-lit mask that suffocates the singer it adorns. We've also seen the invention of hierarchy, tools that reminded people of their place, not just above or below, but outside: the shame clasps, the widow's ladders, the herb wall skirts worn like invitations to judgment. These were not inventions of utility, but of message. They whispered, "You are different now." And people believed them, because when every tool around you tells you something about yourself, that your hands are unclean, your posture imperfect, your voice unworthy, it becomes difficult to believe otherwise. But perhaps the saddest pattern in all these inventions is this: they were handed down. Not inherited like a treasure, but repeated like a mistake, told too often to forget. The fear of fire passed to the night spark cloth, the fear of madness to the trepanation blade, the fear of difference to the pillory, the fear of time to the confession abacus. And because they were quiet, many endured. The loud failures are easy to discard: the flying pigeon seed scatterer, the collapsing stage, the scent carousel that caught fire. But the small ones, the belts, the bowls, the cranks and collars, they nestled into daily life. They were taught, normalised, repaired when broken, passed to the next child, the next scribe, the next midwife. And so the damage compounded, not through explosion, but through repetition. But now we have walked the full circle. We have seen the bones of bridges that never bore weight. We have heard the bells rung not for salvation, but for silence. We have counted the bruises left by well-meaning hands. And in the end, what remains? A quiet admiration. Because despite it all, despite the blood, the fire, the ridiculous wheels and cages and scorched slippers, the people of the Middle Ages tried. They tried to understand the world before the microscope. They tried to govern fairness before democracy. They tried to heal the soul before psychology and clean the body before soap. And in doing so, they stumbled. Often. But if there is beauty in failure, and there is, it lies in the honesty of effort. So many of these inventions are gone now, some melted down, some buried, some turned to rust in the dark soil behind forgotten chapels. But they are not meaningless. They whisper to us across time. They say, I didn't work, but I mattered. Because history is not just a story of victories, it is a collection of attempts, of drawings on parchment, of words scratched into wood, of broken gears and bent nails and jars of dried herbs that never cured a thing. And even the worst of these inventions, the ones that wounded, silenced, or misled, tell us something true, that we have always been trying to make sense of a world too large to hold. And that perhaps is the most human invention of all, the desire to understand, even in the dark.